So, for our first writer, we have Michael Wettengel, who is an author, a painter, and sometimes boxer. He got a couple master's degree from Iowa State University a few years ago, and now he teaches at North Central College and Benedictine University. He loves Kurt Vonnegut and Earl Grey tea, but he says none of that's important right now. Right now, he's just happy to be here reading for you. So please clap him to the stage.
Hi. Hello. Is this good? Okay, cool. How am I going to do this? I should have just used paper. I'm a millennial. I use technology. It's different. It's weird. I'm so used to being in front of a classroom, but I don't usually use a microphone. Anyway, hi everyone. Happy to be with you today. What I'm going to be reading for you all is part of the first chapter of my fantasy novel, which I have been swearing that I'm almost done with for about 2 years now, so you can know how well that's going. The work is called Walk Off the World. I know fantasy isn't a lot of people's sort of like cup of tea. It's not their usual first choice. And it certainly gets a bad rep. I heard about it all the time when I was getting my grad degrees. And that's kind of what I've tapped into to maybe sort of change some perceptions around what fantasy can and can't do. I've tapped into some of the anxieties of my generation, things like climate change, reliance on AI, a world that seems to have kind of left young people behind that insists that this is the way it has to be and it's the way it's always going to be. So, it's a real feel-good kind of book. So hopefully some of that comes through. You'll hear a chapter, and there'll be little sub-chapters. I stole it from Stephen King, so, you can blame him for that. Okay. I should be less nervous. I do this every day. Chapter 1, The Saved World. 1. The storm came out of the west. The last of summer's heat collided with autumn's first chill. Enver City closed its shutters tight. Folk climbed their roofs, sharp and steepled like the contours of the surrounding mountains in patched, rotted shingles. It rained all day, and the next. It beat the earth like mallets. The horizon disappeared beneath a thunderhead membrane. The city sat exiled in its own gray domain. A drowner, the Enverites called storms like these. High in the mountains, tall trees once had kept the ground solid, but the last of them had been uprooted with the previous year's storms. So nothing stopped the floodwaters from cleansing the dark soil and carrying it, first by feet and then by ton, into the city's lower exchange. Esten watched the raging waters tear the exchange's beloved basalt columns, old when the city was still new, from their moorings. He watched the waters pulverize storm fronts and homes that had stood for decades or centuries. He watched this doom from as close as he could. The floodwaters lapped the lips of his broken-in shoes. The rain played jag time on the brim of his hat. He was tall and strong for only 12, and from behind, passers-by might have mistaken him for a young man several years older. But Esten stood alone, the sole witness. The storm and all it brought hadn't come as a surprise. A great flood will destroy the lower exchange, the prophesiers had declared months ago, assembled before the whole city. And that was that. Prophesiers didn't predict like charlatan magicians. They forecasted, and forecasts were foregone conclusions, inevitabilities. Prophesiers flip ahead in the book of the world, Esten's father had once explained to him, so they can tell us what happens on the next page. But that page had been unfortunately mum about the fate of the exchange's residents. While a few people had packed their things and got clear of the destruction, many simply carried on with their lives, drastically shortened though they were to be. They had made peace with the belief that they were just minor actors in that book of the world, due to be swept off stage at the author's urging. Esten watched a house be ground into matchwood. Amidst the foaming wreckage, a pale figure struggled briefly against, then disappeared beneath the waters. A basket, the sort children carried to pick autumn pine cones for potpourri, bumped into Esten's shoe, lingered for a moment as if surprised to see the boy standing there, and then floated away. De la, Esten recited numbly. Such is the way of things. He turned away and looked across the length of the city. Barely visible through the downpour, and set atop a squat plateau, sat the city's aqueduct. Its many windows glowed like silver stars. It had once been a king's palace, back before kings had become obsolete. Esten lived up there. His father lived up there. The reverency with all its prophecies and forecasts ruled the city from up there. Every day the Enverites gazed up at that place in deference. No more queens or kings, the reverency had proclaimed almost 3 centuries ago. No more priests, no more gods, no more tyrants of any strain. The wise man has saved the world from itself. Esten fixed the aqueduct with a gaze of naked hate. 2. Now pay attention, his father told him. This will be important. Esten nodded, said nothing. Restraint had always been his way. He rubbed the pinky, the one missing its top joint, on his right hand. He shifted on his uncomfortable chair. He realized that this was a room unused to hosting guests. He'd never been to a professor's office before. He knew their kind was, on the whole, reclusive and strange. They spent long hours every day in lightless, soundless rooms communing with the wise man. Yet Esten felt cold despite the midsummer evening warmth. The office was dimly lit and curved in an obese crescent. A pair of gauzy curtains trembled minutely in the faint mountain breeze from the ajar balcony door. That balcony, a cheery sort of place good for hosting parties with friends, struck Esten as a kind of vulgar joke. Much of the room, from its mostly bare shelves to the vast desk that cut the space nearly in two, felt designed for a human being, but was instead inhabited by something only masquerading as such. Esten was sure if he pressed his hand into the nearby sofa, its cushions would give off little puffs of neglected dust. "Where is she?" Esten whispered. "Patience," his father said. He smiled, turned his eyes into little slits. "You know how they are, always on their own time." Esten's father looked nothing like him. Esten was broad and powerful, dark-skinned with kinked hair. His father was thin, pale, almost waifish, his light hair edged toward silver. But Esten loved him, and he was loved in return, so what did it matter if they didn't share blood? His father wore a wrap, a single piece of gray cloth draped and pinned to form tunic, sleeves, collar, and waistline. Its collection of purple tassels marked him as a scholar and a kind of ordained altruist, one of the smiling forward faces of the reverency, and likely the only breed of reverent most people would ever see up close. He leaned over. "You know, Robin Hulkenhauer told me that she's finally made a friend." Esten would believe it when he saw it. "Want to know who it is?" "Who?" His father smiled. Tobacco stained his teeth. His breath stank. It always did. "No," Esten said. "Me? Why? Sulkenhauer's so..." He frowned. "Sad." Maybe she's happy somebody finally noticed that about her. Esten studied his hands. It's hard not to. "Why not just ask her yourself?" "Just think about it." He squeezed Esten's shoulder. "All right?" The door behind them swung open. A woman stood in the doorway. She couldn't have been older than 30, but exhaustion poured off her, aging her by years. Her wraps were set with a professor's blue tassels and silver embroidery, but for the moment she only stared at Esten and his father as if she had no earthly idea who they were. Then she rubbed her eyes, bloodshot and probably paper dry, and her surprise vanished. "Oh," she said. Her voice was even drier than her eyes. "Marius, you brought Esten?" "He's my son," he said simply. The professor crossed the room, stopping at her desk. She pulled an amulet up and over her head, a glass bead filled with clear water strung on black thread. If she set it down, it would mean that she, as a professor, was free of her duties of her station until tomorrow. But she only stood there, a dissipated silhouette in the dog day's waning light. The glass bead glowed like amber. Then, with an effort and begrudgingly, she set the amulet back on her shoulders. Esten swore he saw those shoulders droop as if the bead was made out of lead. The professor stood at the balcony door, the curtains curling around her face and ankles. Outside, an eagle screeched. "Lots of other orphans call you father," she said. Marius patted Esten's back. His touch, Esten had long ago learned, was a sign of his convictions. His touch said, "This is good. This is all right." "You wanted to come," Marius said. But Esten knew he was the only one that Marius had asked. The professor netted her pallid hands behind her back. They were lined with shallow red scratches and her fingernails had been gnawed short. "The lower exchange is doomed," she said flatly. "You know this." Marius said nothing. The whole city knew it. He'd spent much of the last week in the exchange trying to convince his residents to flee before summer turned to autumn and brought them all to ruin. He could count his successes on both hands. It took the efforts of every professor in this aqueduct to pluck that truth from the river, she said. However, as we communed, she tensed. Her thin shoulders looked like a wooden hanger beneath her wraps. She corrected unhappily, I heard your name, Marius. Nothing unusual. In their special rooms, prophecyers strained all their senses inward toward the river. It ran through everything, everyone, everywhere. It was fate. It was the book the prophecyers turned pages in to see what would happen next. The wise man spoke, the river flowed through his mouth. And I heard, the prophesier clenched her hands. I heard, she said again, straining, that you would die, Marius, 4 months from today. The eagle cried again. A fly hauled itself through the office, landing on one of the prophecyer's cracked knuckles. How? Marius asked. His voice was small but steady. Silence. The prophecyer only shook her head. The river didn't say, he asked. More silence. Ah, Marius breathed. So it'll be a quiet death. He swallowed and turned to Esten. A bead of sweat quivered above one eyebrow. Son, he said, that means... Esten knew what it meant. It meant Marius would empty out, first in mind, not unlike common melancholy, and then in body. This wasn't a diagnosis, it was a death sentence. Nobody ever survived a quiet dying. And anything the prophecyers heard in the river was inevitable, just the way of things. Dila. But prophecyers, despite their best efforts, were still human, fallible. Esten stood. You're wrong. Silence again. It passed like an hour. Esten's heart hid in his stomach. And I'm done.